Okay, wonderful, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the launch of the Social Norms Atlas. We're extremely happy to have you here. So since we're on the hour, we'll go ahead and begin. Okay, Rob, can everyone see my screen now? Okay, wonderful. I'm going to assume we're all set with screen sharing. Okay, so everyone, thanks so much again for joining us for the Social Norms Atlas launch. My name is Jasmine Uysal, and I'm a research project manager at the Center on Gender Equity and Health. And I'm here with a lovely panel of my colleagues from the Social Norms Learning Collaborative to introduce this new resource to you today. Before we begin, just a few reminders. Please keep your microphone on mute when you're not speaking, and please use the chat box to drop in questions throughout the panelist presentations. So today, our agenda includes doing a quick introduction and welcome, which I'm doing right now. Then we'll go over the introduction to the Social Norms Atlas. Then we'll move into presentations from 3 featured sectors of the Social Norms Atlas. And then we'll have a presentation from the cross-sector analysis from all 10 sectors. Then a panel discussion, which will last about 25 minutes. And finally, our closing. So definitely be sure to drop all your questions in as we go. Okay, so what will we be doing today? Today we'll be answering these questions. What is the Social Norms Atlas? What content is featured in the Atlas sectors? How can researchers and practitioners use this new tool in their work? What are some key social norms, attitudes, and behaviors in these 3 sectors? What are some of the meta-norms identified across these sectors? And last but certainly not least, where can you access the Social Norms Atlas? So now moving into our introduction of the Social Norms Atlas. As we remember, there are, 3, we have behaviors, attitudes, and social norms. And the Social Norms Atlas came into existence to really help researchers, but particularly programmers and practitioners, understand the differences between these 3 concepts and see examples of how to use these concepts across these 10 different implementation sectors. So I'm sure many people here are familiar, but just as a friendly reminder, for behaviors, we have the actions what we do, the actions that we perform on a daily basis. For an example, a behavior is brushing my teeth. Then we have attitudes, personal evaluations about how the world should be, whether we evaluate something as favorably or unfavorably. So I might like or not like brushing my teeth in the morning, which could be an attitude. And then we have social norms, what I think people do and should or should not do in my community, or my perceptions of typical and appropriate behavior within my social network. So to take this toothbrushing example another step, it's a social norm that most everyone in my community brushes their teeth before they go to work in the morning. So the point as a reminder of the Social Norms Atlas is really to lay out examples of these behaviors, attitudes, and social norms across these development sectors that our learning collaborative members have identified as important and illustrative and that are connected. So what is the Social Norms Atlas? It's an online and PDF resource of behaviors, social norms, and attitudes relevant to a variety of implementation sectors. This is for program planners, implementers, evaluators, and researchers. And our goal is to increase awareness and ability to address a variety of social norms and thereby enhance the efficacy of our behavior change programs in achieving our targeted outcomes. What is in the Social Norms Atlas? It contains 3 main sections. First, there's an introduction to the Atlas, which gives a broad overview of the Atlas content and also social norms, attitudes, and behaviors. In the next section, there are examples of social norms, behaviors, and attitudes across 10 sectors. Those 10 sectors are listed on the right of the screen here, include COVID-19, education, harmful traditional practices, intimate partner violence, nutrition, provider behavior, sexual and reproductive health, technology, violence against children, and women's economic empowerment. Today, we'll be hearing from 3 of those sectors, which are featured for this event, and that will include education, harmful traditional practices, and women's economic empowerment, as you can see highlighted here. Finally, the resource closes with a cross-sector analysis, highlighting meta-norms that cut across each of these different sectors. And as a reminder, meta-norms are the broad norms that are foundational and shared across many contexts. Within each sector, there's information including the introduction to the sector, which outlines a bit of the state of the evidence on social norms within this sector, and the particular lens which sector leads took for this analysis. Then the sector will move into illustrative lists of the related behaviors, attitudes, and influential social norms, featuring a maximum of 5 for each of those. Then there is a case study presenting a program or research study which applies these concepts in the sector. Finally, there's a listing of promising practices gathered from literature and featured resources unique to these sectors and social norms. And finally, a listing of our citations. The Atlas was developed using a 3-stage approach. First, we held a crowdsourcing social norms webinar with our Learning Collaborative members to brainstorm social norms across these 10 development sectors. Then we engaged sector leads to coordinate a process with our Learning Collaborative contributors to develop content. And this included many months actually of going back and forth between our leads and our co-collaboration teams to outline the Atlas content. And finally, review content was submitted by each sector, and it was reviewed by the internal team. And then the cross-sector analysis was done along with design for publishing. So very importantly, the Atlas can be accessed on the Align platform at this URL that you see here. Okay, and with that, we're going to move right into our presentations from the 3 featured sectors and the cross-sector analysis. So we're going to start with Rachel Marcus speaking on the education sector. Rachel?
Thank you, Jasmine. Could we have the next slide, please? So in the education sector, we focus particularly on formal primary and secondary education to narrow it down to keep it manageable. And we paid particular attention to norms around gender and disability, though you'll see some other examples in there too. We focused on 3 main areas. So these are children's access to school, so the norms that prevent particular groups of children from being able to attend, teacher practices, in particular corporal punishment, but also the way that teachers treat particular groups of students based on norms about what they can do reflecting their gender or disability. And we also looked at norms among students, such as bullying under the school-based violence banner. And unlike some of the other sectors in this atlas, we included evidence from low, middle and high income country contexts as we wanted to look at norms that affected LGBTQ students, and we found more evidence from high income countries. In general, a challenge for us in this education group was finding evidence that was framed in terms of norms and their effects, as that's not so common in the education sector, or rather it's becoming more common, but hasn't been so previously. Next slide, please. So this slide gives some examples of the norms that we've highlighted in this guide. There was a lot of evidence on norms around the decisions that parents make around prioritizing particularly sons over daughters in some low-income contexts, and then the attitudes that underpin that, in terms of preferring to send sons than daughters to school, or prioritizing spending on sons' educational needs, because there are many nuances to that. Everything that we have here is sort of quite a simplified version of many of the possible norms that occur in particular places. And then, finally teasing that through from the behaviour through the attitude to the norm of what people in my community expect. So in this case, that they'll prioritise their son's education over that of their daughters. To take another example, we also looked at corporal punishment, a common practice in many schools, despite the fact that it's also often illegal. And the fact that teachers, many times, well, even though that is the law bans corporal punishment, think that it's appropriate and necessary to maintain order. But also the fact that that there's a kind of an unstated norm among teachers that is what you do if students misbehave, and that other teachers may, for example, think you're weak or not a good teacher, or that you're maybe like a young teacher just out of training college who doesn't know what's what if you don't use corporal punishment. So that's another example of one of the ways that norms can impact even when they diverge from attitudes and behaviours. One of the things I wanted also to say about the process we went through in compiling this education section, I mentioned that it was often quite hard to find studies that explicitly discussed norms. And I think that's because quite a lot of the behaviours and practices in the education sector that we wanted to look at perhaps reflect unconscious biases or conscious biases, such as gender stereotypes or beliefs about what children with disabilities can or can't do, or, for example, in other contexts, about the expected behaviour or the capacities of children, say, from minority ethnic groups or of a certain caste. But those were not generally framed in terms of norms. They were more framed in terms of stereotypes and biases. And so that made it quite a challenge for us to cover the range of issues that we might otherwise have liked to have done. Can we move to the next slide, please? So then we moved from discussing, outlining some of the norms, behaviours and attitudes to a case study of initiative that aimed to achieve change. And this was contributed by one of our group from World Vision, and it's a case study of an initiative in Malawi that aims to eradicate gender-based violence in schools by instituting what's called a whole school approach. So that means engaging teachers and other school staff, engaging students, engaging the community, both parents, other family members, influential community members, to try to really set up a new norm that there should not be violence in school, that children have the right to go to school safely, so they should also not experience violence en route to school, and then to agree how that can be achieved. So often that's through having discussions in schools, in the community, about alternatives to violent discipline. It's about, educating members of the community to intervene if they see violence occurring. It's about having discussions on norms of masculinity, for example, that perhaps allow boys to sexually harass or even rape girls, or to touch them inappropriately in school. So all of those are intended to try to shift norms around what's appropriate in terms and acceptable in terms of violence. But as you can see, they're also backed up with structures and mechanisms within schools, such as establishing codes of conduct for teachers and students, and mechanisms to report school violence. And finally, also actions to improve school physical environments to make them safer, and often with a strong focus on toilets. And so the The project was initiated last year with a baseline survey, and after a year of implementation, there'll be an end line to look at how far norms have shifted. Next slide, please. Finally, or almost finally, the education section ends with a few promising practices on ways to shift norms within the sector. So as you can see, 2 of them are around building teacher skills and knowledge. Sometimes this is done through in-service training for teachers who are already working, sometimes done also at pre-service level when teachers are in training. Another promising example we have is of community-based approaches, such as the ones that we discussed in the case study from Malawi, of engaging with different members of a school community to try to shift attitudes and norms. And of course, this is also common in efforts to where there are big gender imbalances in school attendance, to encourage parents to send their daughters and to set up a new norm that that's what others expect them in the community to do. Finally, we feature a number of resources that could give more information on norms in education. And this is one example, which is again on the Line website. So now I think I hand over to Rahinatu to talk about the next sector on harmful traditional practices. And thank you very much. No, I'm wrong. It's Sarah next.
Yes, wonderful. We'll now have Sarah Gowin speaking about women's economic empowerment. Sarah, feel free to take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So this part of the Social Norms Atlas really explored the norms, attitudes, and behaviors that underpin women's economic empowerment and outcomes that lead to improvements in women's economic empowerment. We focused particularly on contexts that were relevant for South Asia, North America, Middle East, and parts of Southern Africa. And we looked very much at contexts where marked inequality in economic outcomes are underpinned by rigid gender norms. And we tried to really sort of look at the literature and excavate which of those norms are affecting these outcomes. We also wanted to share examples where social norms and power dynamics shape household behavior and the sort of decision-making that takes place in the household that affects economic outcomes beyond the household. Next slide, please. So, as in a similar way to all of the other social norms analyses that we list here, we went through a series of different reports, literature, analyses, interventions that attempted to define behaviors that also linked these behaviors to particular attitudes and then tried to surface some of those influential social norms. So the behaviors that we were looking at very much focused on that sort of gender division of labor within the household and gender-defined roles and responsibilities within the household. So some of these behaviors that very much affect women's ability to learn and to earn are obviously related to their roles as caregivers, that women perform a disproportionate amount of unpaid care work, and that these social norms really underpin those gender roles, that men disproportionately specialize in earning and working in the labor market and remunerated employment, and are disproportionately the primary breadwinner for many families. And we also looked at some of the other behaviors. In this particular case, we wanted to surface some of these changing, shifting behaviors where perhaps social norms have been shifting over time, to highlight that they're not static, that they can be modified. So in this particular case, we also draw attention to the fact that women may have disproportionate control over, or can become or able to execute more control over household budgets, perhaps. So what are the attitudes that may underpin these behaviors, these observed behaviors? Well, believing that women should care for their families and that women who care for their families are good wives and mothers. So these are the kinds of opinions and attitudes that we were able to find in the literature that people had explicitly engaged with in the path of using interventions perhaps to change outcomes. The idea that it is very much the man's responsibility to generate income underpins that gender division of labor where men work outside the household and women and children are dependents of a male breadwinner. And then this last one is linked to sort of changing attitudes and changing behaviors, believing that men and women should have equal decision-making power in household purchases. This is a kind of shifting attitude that shifts social norms. So if we go through the social norms that we found and identified, you can see here some of the norms that are expressed about what people believe that women should be doing and expect that women should be doing. So people in my community expect that women will stay at home to care for the children. This is a quote from India and similarly from Afghanistan. It's very similar in these two contexts. People in my community expect that men will be the sole income earners for their families. And this is a very sort of loaded statement in many ways because it tells you about expectations or sort of diminished expectations of diminished masculinity if men are not the sole income earners. People in my community think that men should make the final decisions about household purchases. So these are the kinds of social norms that we looked at that affect the sort of domains of being and doing, if you take a kind of Sen vision of the world, that affect the domains of empowerment. Next slide, please. So we looked at a particular case study. And this case study was investigated. It's a World Bank report. You can find all of the links to the literature that looked at perceptions of women's labor force participation. And it tried to excavate some of these sort of norm deviations and see if you provide more information about what's going on more generally, can you shift some of these social norms around women's labor force participation? So this is an example from Saudi Arabia, where it was found in a series of in-depth interviews and analyses that men privately support more female labor force participation, but they actually underestimate, they misperceive the collective social norms about women's labor force participation. They might believe that they are more norm deviant than the rest of their community. So correcting these beliefs, engaging in household dialogues and interactions that enable men in particular to understand that perhaps these social norms are shifting in their communities and that it's more widely held that it is acceptable for women to work, is one way to begin to support women's economic empowerment in these contexts. And it can alter, it can shift these norms and the prevalence and really sort of foster behaviors that support female labor force participation. So there was an intervention, a series of dialogues and engagement, and men that were exposed to the intervention as a result of this project were distinctly more supportive of wives joining the labor force, and wives were more likely to have applied for a job outside the home than those who did not receive the intervention. So again, it's one of these, it's a very helpful way of understanding that these norms are not static, and that if you deliberatively engage with them, you have the potential to increase the sort of ambit of social choice and freedom that can support women's economic empowerment. Next slide, please. So if we look across the literature at some of the promising practices that we found there to really sort of foster women's economic empowerment, a lot of the work, a lot of the interventions, a lot of the analysis focus on household dialogues to address household inequality in these sort of rigid construction of gender norms that underpin roles and responsibilities that are very sharply defined. So the more engagement, the more discussion, the more sort of fostering of dialogues within households and particularly with couples to promote equitable gender relations, the greater chances that interventions that were about expanding women's economic opportunities were successful. Another key part of the literature also focuses on engaging men and boys in household programming to shift these gender norms, but also to reduce backlash. And then a third sort of bucket of work we saw was a lot of very deliberate, very carefully designed work with savings groups and around women's financial inclusion and their financial literacy, so that women had the opportunities to access a key productive resource, financial services, financial resources, to enable them to make choices around income earning. And so when you engage with those savings groups, there's also very sort of deliberate and thoughtful programming around women and girls earning and controlling income, their right to have access to income, their right to dispose of income, their right to accumulate assets, their right to be equal partners in financial decision-making about welfare and well-being in the household. And so here we also draw attention to a fantastic resource that came out of SEEP and a collaboration with Oxfam about shifting social norms in the economy for women's economic empowerment. And I think this is one of the wonderful achievements of this really kind of co-created collaborative work, is that there are some fantastic resources that are very helpful for practitioners. So I would recommend that you delve deep into them. Next slide, please. And I am passing over now to Reginato. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah, so much. That was just riveting. And yes, now I'd like to introduce Reginato to speak to us about harmful traditional practices. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jasmine and Sarah, Rachel. Yeah, so as a group, we looked at harmful traditional practices. And first, I'll take you through to what we understand as harmful traditional practices. And for us, this include behaviors and practices that are harmful to people's physical and mental health, but are generally defended on the basis of tradition, culture, religion, or superstition. And some of the areas we looked around female genital mutilation, child marriage, corporal punishment, and so many other harmful traditional practices, such as marrying a deceased husband's brother. So, and then most of the work we looked at and the examples we walked through as a group are from Central and South Asia, East and West Africa, and the Middle East. Next slide, please. Yeah, so now we're going to look at some of the behaviors that are linked to attitudes that link to other influential social norms. So some of the behaviors that came out very strong from the discussion we had and the resources that we looked at were young girls undergo female genital mutilation. And the attitude linking to that is, I think girls who are caught are pure and chaste. So when you look at that, you see that people go into this thinking that, okay, once a girl is being mutilated, then she becomes pure, she is chaste. And for most society that practices, this is like the ultimate goal. This is what they want from a girl. And so these attitudes or behaviors linked to, in my community, people expect girls to be caught to be suitable for marriage. So you can see how this behavior links to attitude and then links to girls needed to be caught for them to be married. And then another example we looked at parents arrange marriage for their daughters. And this is around child early marriage. Parents arrange marriage for their daughters below the age of 18. So, and the attitude coming out from there is, I believe that girls should get married when they reach puberty to protect the family honor. So the girls are seen as the people that protect the family honor, and they need to be married off as soon as they reach puberty for them to be able to secure that family honor. So most people in my community think that a girl should be married as soon as she reaches puberty to prevent premarital sex. So once a girl starts developing, reaches puberty, to prevent any dishonor to the family, we need to marry her off. So that's the whole idea around that. So for the family honor to remain, we need to marry our girls off. So, and then another behavior we looked at, widows marry their deceased husband's brothers. Okay, and the attitude around that is that, in my opinion, a woman should marry her deceased husband's brother because she would be financially protected. So you can see how some of these attitudes and some of these behaviors are linked to around the economic, because if you look at this, it's around protecting the woman's economy, making sure that the woman is okay financially, not about her being able to provide herself, but then marry the brother so that she can be provided for. And then the influential norm around there is that in my community, people expect a widow to marry her deceased husband's brother. So next slide, please, Jasmine. Yasmin, next slide.
Yeah. Can you see it? It should show the case study now. Hello?
I can't see the next slide.
Oh, interesting. Okay, let's see. Do you see that now?
Can you hear me, Jasmine?
Rahina, we can see the slide.
Okay.
I think there's just a
now
delay
I can
for
find.
you.
Okay. Yeah, I've been struggling with my network. Yeah. So we looked at the same case study, the World Bank report, and then what we looked at is around evaluation of intervention to address the root cause of child, early and forced marriage. And for us to be able to address harmful traditional practices, we need to understand what are those root causes that are leading to child, early, forced marriage. Okay, and then this report promotes the rights of adolescent girls through multi-level programming and multi-level advocacy and learning initiatives. Initiative theory of change proposed that expanding girls' agency, transforming their relationships, and shifting gender norms are all needed to end child early forced marriage. So improving their agency for girls to be able to demand or to be able to have the choices around them has proven that it can shift gender norms around child early forced marriage. Okay. Also, the report found increased girls' reproductive health and mobility and shifting of norms to justify delay around child early forced marriage. So understanding what are those root causes that lead to child early marriage is very important when it comes to trying to shift the norms around harmful traditional practices, especially around child early forced marriage. What are those root causes? What is making them? Why are they still existing? Why are people still sticking to them? So those are very important things that with the report is trying to show. Yeah, please next slide.
Wonderful.
Okay.
The next slide should
It's finally here. Yeah, it's coming up now. Okay, so what are those promising practices for the addressing in harmful traditional practices? Okay, so I think one of the most important things is focusing on grandmothers as the entry points to preventing female genital mutilation. So, because most of the resources, most of the reports that we've read, most of the things that we've come across when it comes to female genital mutilation, you find out that older generation women are the ones that are making sure that this practice continues. So, how do you engage with them? How do you talk with them? What are the ways in which you can relate with grandmothers or older women within the community to ensure that female genital mutilations through cutting is a practice that is not a practice happening anymore. Okay, so and then also one of the areas we've seen coming out in most of the reports is around including child marriage in school curriculums for adolescents, making adolescents understand what child marriage is, and then also making them understand the effect of child marriage, where they are the ones that can talk about this practice as not as being negative to them. Okay, and then also combining a public health information approach with a theological scriptural approach and engaging faith leaders. This, I think, for me, is one of the most important approaches, looking at some of the work we've done around harmful traditional practices. Because when you look at most traditional practices, they are based on tradition, they are based on religion, and they are based on scriptures. So when you engage the religious and traditional leaders around these issues and make them understand how negative these practices are, it makes for easy engagement with the community, and these leaders end up supporting and providing the much needed trust within the community for you to be able to bring whatever approach you're trying to bring to the community. And one of the resources that we used is the harmful traditional practices, your question, our answer, which is from Gender and Development Network. So this is a very interesting resource, and I think a deep dive into it will be a good opportunity for better understanding around harmful traditional practices. Next slide, or am I?
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Renatu. That was a lovely presentation. Now, last but certainly not least, we're going to hear from Dr. Rebecca Lundgren to go over results from the cross-sector analysis. Rebecca?
Thanks, Jasmine. I'm really excited to talk about this section with you. As you can tell from my fellow panelists, this has been an amazing collaboration, one of the most exciting of my career, really. And my colleague and I, Anjali Kohli, and I had the privilege to look across the patterns, looking at each of the 10 sectors to identify influential norms, which we're calling and are known as meta-norms, and consider their implications for social norms related programming. Next slide, please. So we used Heisey and Manji's definition of meta-norms, which you see here on the slide. We're talking about those norms that are, deeply rooted. They connect with deeply rooted determinants. They operate at multiple levels, and they influence different behaviors. So in this analysis, we're really looking at all of those norms that we identified, each sector identified, we're considering those proximal norms. So those are the norms that are most close to the behavior that we're trying to influence. And the meta-norms are those norms that are influencing those proximal norms. So understanding what meta-norms are, how they operate, and how to change them is very nascent. We know that shifting them is likely to require more time and effort than shifting proximal norms, and it will also require adaptive responses to prevent and mitigate resistance and backlash. So as an example, think about the expectation that men are the ultimate decision makers in the household. Investing and shifting that norm is going to require probably more effort and resources than simply shifting the expectation that women can make specific decisions about household purchases. So we're really looking here at those more deeper norms. So next slide, Jasmine. So let me talk a little bit about the methods we use. So we went through the 50 norms that came up. So as you've learned now, there's 5 norms for each of the 10 sectors. Then we tagged them with the sector, and we looked at them to figure out, to sort of brainstorm what might be the meta-norms that were aligned or influencing that particular proximal norm. Not each proximal norm could have more than one meta-norm, and not all of the proximal norms got meta-norms. Some of them are there, but we didn't find a meta-norm attached to it. We then went back and spent some time actually defining what that meta-norm was, crafting it, thinking about it, looking at the literature, and we came up with 6 meta-norms that you see here. And then we went back and reclassified or categorized or coded all of the norms that we had. So what's interesting to me, I think what we found is that, this analysis across multiple sectors, they really, all of them related in some way to power. So many involve power over others, or even, so even norms around protection and privacy are still about power, using power to protect others or to make decisions about how information is shared. Next slide, please. This is what we did, is we looked at each sector and analyzed the distribution of metanorms per sector. So here I'm just pulling out two sectors, two metanorms. And here there were, as you know, there were 50 norms, and most of them related to gender ideology. So 34 of the norms were tagged with gender ideology, and many relate to control and violence. There's 21 of those. And then the next kind of highest tagged metanorm was authority. So we were really looking, a lot of the metanorms were around control, violence, and authority. And this was, really noteworthy to us because we were looking at sectors that were not specifically focused on gender. So this really showed, the really key role of this deep sort of, gender ideologies in behavior. Next slide, please. So this slide shows it's kind of flipped. So this shows the sector. So this shows education, and then it shows the norms that are the metanorms that were tagged to each of the proximal norms. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about it in a little bit more detail for the empowerment section. Yeah, so here you can see that women's economic empowerment was tagged with was tagged with power, with gender, with control, and authority. So you can see the purple icons there are the ones around gender. So you can see that's quite predominant here, but also control and authority. So this analysis shows us that, which we already knew, but it shows it in a visual way that the relationship between norms and behavior is complex. It's not one-to-one. There are multiple kind of combinations here. Multiple norms influence the behavior. Norms sometimes act individually or in combination with other norms and factors. And interestingly, a single proximal norm, so that's the norm that's closer to the behavior we're interested in, may be rooted in more than one metanorm. So if we look at this example here, you can see the norm that women who leave home without approval can be punished. So that is associated with control, gender ideology, and authority. So next slide, please. So here's an same analysis looking at traditional practices. And I just want to close with some insights about, or some thoughts about what this information or insights might have on practicing. So first, it tells us that programming to shift any single norm to kind of influence behavior may need to touch on more than one metanorm. That challenging or shifting those metanorms could be perceived as more threatening to existing power hierarchies, and might be more likely to trigger resistance and backlash. So maybe, getting women power to, make decisions about household purchases is not going to, perhaps will not be as triggering as really trying to change the underlying norms around men being, having authority in the household. So this also tells us that it's important to carefully identify social norms to understand how they're enforced, how they influence behavior, and anticipate possible resistance. So, finally, that it's important that programs work closely with communities and organizations to engage in this thinking, to identify these norms, and to design program strategies that are feasible and acceptable, and to think through any kind of strategies they might want to put in place to put in place mitigation and monitoring and response plans. So there are resources that are available to help programs and communities do this. A few of them have been developed by the Learning Collaborative. So, and you can find them online. So I'm thinking, for example, of the Social Norms Exploration Tool, which can help organizations dig in to understand sort of what are those norms. Also Getting Practical, which is a resource to help really dig in on your understanding of norms and their features to plan interventions to address norms. And of course, there are many other resources out there as well that you can explore. So just in closing, I'd say this kind of journey through the social norms of 10 very diverse sectors suggests that effective behavior change really do need to tackle issues of gender inequity, gender norms and power even when gender inequity is not a primary outcome of the project. So with that, I will turn it back to Jasmine.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was a lovely presentation. Great to hear about those meta norms. Okay, wonderful. Now we're going to move into our audience-driven panel session. We will be taking questions from the audience and giving those to our panelists. And I'm going to actually hand this over to my colleague, Jamie Greenberg, to lead this. Jamie?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jasmine. Okay, so I'm going to go around and put one question at least to each panelist, and then there's a question that I think we could ask everybody. So the first question is for Rachel from Florence, who says that in her experience and looking at the literature, simply training or doing capacity building of teachers on gender issues may be insufficient to change fundamental beliefs and attitudes and to equip them to teach children in gender transformative ways. So she asks, do you have experience of more successful approaches to accompany teachers into a deeper deconstruction of gender norms? We'll stop it at that. There's a more specific part of that question, but.
Sure. Yes, I think that's absolutely right. That, you know, training on its own, particularly if it's, you know, a short training that's delinked from, you know, everyday practice, you know, rarely leads to lasting change. But on the other hand, it is part of the picture. There have been some examples where, you know, of training that has been very reflective, that has enabled teachers to reflect on, you know, their own deeply held gender beliefs and biases, and how that plays out in their own families as well as their practice in the classroom, and some evidence that that's led to deeper change. But it does need quite a specific set of circumstances to enable that to happen. It needs a school to be supportive, to give teachers enough time to do it. It needs real support and encouragement to take part in those sessions. It needs supportive school leadership for, you know, to enable changes to be implemented that come out of that thinking and reflection, and to generally support a gender egalitarian ethos in schools. I think also, you know, what continued support and coaching and backup resources and so on has generally been shown to be very helpful. You know, people leave training or reflective session enthused and wishing to implement and make changes, but as time goes on, they get back into their everyday life and job, and it's harder and harder to remember to sustain those. So that backup support can make a real difference. And then finally, I would also say that, you know, if there are mechanisms and structures within a school, whether that's like a teacher support group or like, you know, I don't know, gender champion or something, that it's possible to discuss issues that arise with, or in the case of gender-based violence in schools, you know, to be able to report or whistleblow, for example, if somebody more powerful is perpetrating that violence. All of those are additional structures that can make training so much more effective. And I'll stop there, as I know there are questions for others too.
Thank you so much, Rachel. There's one more question for you. If I drop it in the chat, could you answer it there? Okay, so then the next question is for Sarah from a username that I think might be Nikki, who says, very interesting to see the case study example from Saudi Arabia and how perceptions of descriptive social norms can make men feel that they're deviating from the social norm more than may be the case. So Sarah, are there examples of this specifically about women's economic empowerment from other countries? And then the follow-up to that is, what resistance did you see?
So I think there are some really great examples actually in the realm of shifting caring roles and responsibilities, because you can't divorce the sort of disproportionate engagement with unpaid care and responsibility from unpaid care from women's economic activities and participation. So if you don't get that right, you're actually just going to increase women's time burdens. You're just going to sort of support projects that engage women economically, but don't necessarily address the unequal responsibilities for caring in the household. And you don't necessarily want to reduce total time spent on caring, because this is about human development and welfare and well-being. So I think if you look at some of the Oxfam work, the We Care work that Oxfam worked on in West Africa and parts of East Africa, they've done some incredible work with men about whether you care, how much household work you do inside the household, how much caring for children you do, and find that men are actually engaging increasingly more in caring, but they perceive it to be a very feminized activity and therefore are not very comfortable talking about how much they take on these responsibilities. And so sort of creating opportunities for household dialogue around that, and reflecting that, in fact, you would be surprised to find out that many more men in your community are caring and cleaning and washing up and changing the baby. And so you gradually help that sort of realization that these roles aren't as rigidly defined. And that actually helps create new norms that are more accepting of the redistribution of unpaid care in a household, and therefore give women more opportunities to earn and learn and do other things, because they're not disproportionately engaged in a task that keeps them very much at home and very much, in the ambit of the household. So I would say Pro Munda is doing fantastic work on this as well. Going back to the sort of the economic side of this, I would hazard a guess that a lot of the work that came out of the sort of 90s on microcredit and backlash and violence, there was this belief that you just sort of tweak a few things, you give women microcredit, and then they can sort of move forward and generate income and start their own businesses. And I think without necessarily addressing some of the restrictive social norms that limit women's ability to do that, we actually saw quite a bit of violence as an unintended consequence associated with microcredit. Now, the literature is spotty on this. It really depends where it took place, what the kind of programming was that was underpinning it. But I think we do see the sort of emergence of that unintended consequences literature. And then the final piece that I would say that's worth looking at is some of Neetu Jan's work in Nepal that was looking at women's labor force participation. And again, without the kinds of social programming that really address social norms and shifting social norms, what she found is that women who worked were more likely to experience violence outside of the home, on the way to the workplace, or even in the workplace, and in the home. So I think without really addressing social norms in a meaningful way through dialogue, through the sort of the gatekeepers of some of these perceptions and the diffusion of these social norms, we will continue to see the kinds of backlash and resistance that are associated with the types of interventions that are not sort of thoughtfully predicated on changing social norms.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So then I have one question for Rahinatu, and then I'm going to ask one broader question to the group and perhaps Rebecca. So Rahinatu, the question is, thinking particularly about harmful traditional practices, is there a way to look at the sector and across sectors on disruptors such as humanitarian emergencies or labor migration shifts, and this impact on normative expectations? So the example given was refugees returning to enable a practice in their home country, or normative differences learned by men during prolonged migration.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I was looking at it and then trying to link it to what we've been talking about all through this conversation. Yeah, I think as much as possible, finding out what are those norms that are making these things to continue to happen. What are those norms that are making those practices that we see as things promoting negative what in the community. Yeah, look, it's necessary, and for us to look at approaches that will enable us to be able to deal with those norms and to be able to provide that shift wherever we find ourselves. Because if you look at it, there are traditions, there are things that are making those things to happen. So even if you look at migration, if you look at any other thing around um, refugees and everything, you see that those traditions that were moved, that those people that migrated moved with from wherever they are coming from, is kind of situated within that refugee camp or wherever they find themselves. And it grows from there because it's something they believe in and it's something that they practice. It's like a way of life for them. So looking at ways of shifting those behaviors are absolutely necessary. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay,
Thank you.
and then I have one broad question that I'll ask each of you to answer in about 30 seconds, just looking at the time. So this is from Erica and Florence, and they both asked the question a little differently, but basically it's, would you recommend that programs target priority meta norms or target proximal norms first, which may have less resistance, and then move on? Or is the recommendation, and it's a broad question, to target meta and proximal norms equally? So maybe we can go in the same order and start. So go Rachel, Sarah, Ratinahu, and perhaps Rebecca if there's time.
So I think both are necessary and important, and it depends on the norm in question. One of the things I've been putting in the chat in response to the question I got on violence against children has been exactly that, actually. It's been around drilling down on the meta norms and objectives about, how to create a positive school environment. And then, after that opening up to a more specific focus on violence against children. Sometimes that can be a more effective way because it both keeps people focused on the main goal, and it means that then anything more controversial comes within the discussion of that main goal. However, I do think this is really quite specific to different issues, and sometimes it's going to be really important to focus on the specific norm, and other times the more meta norm. So sorry, that's quite a general answer.
Gosh, that's a wonderful question. And I'm really just absorbing now how it might affect the design of women's economic empowerment initiatives. And I think what I would love to do is really understand in particular contexts how the meta norms and the proximal norms are nested. And so I think, this would be about a much deeper excavation around. So I was really struck by the sort of ranking of authority through control and violence to that sort of central core meta-norm of gender ideology in the women's economic empowerment sphere. And I would love to see, okay, let's look at how this takes place in, Haryana or in, parts of the, Chiapas. And if I'm designing an economic empowerment program, I think it would be very, very helpful to understand that nesting and see sort of where you might begin to target messaging, dialogue, support, and engagement in that community to sort of peel the onion on that nesting. I think it's a really thoughtful way for us to address the next phase of social norms work.
Thank you, Sarah. Ratinahu, if you have anything to add in about 30 seconds, and then we'll turn it over to Jasmine to close.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting how we're looking at the meta-norms and the proxy-norms and how they all kind of come together, allowing for practitioners to understand the social norms deeper, and when they are designing programs on how to make sure that none of those proxy norms, meta norms are being left out, and if they're going to focus on one, which we're going to focus on. So it's quite interesting when you see one behavior or one norms influencing norms with so many different meta norms and proxy norms. So yes, it's very interesting, and I think to all of this and trying to walk around them as a practitioner, it's interesting, and I think we look forward to diving more into it and understanding it. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you so much. And Jasmine, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you all for the wonderful questions and discussion. It's really interesting to see how you're all thinking about this product and how you're already applying your questions in the field to it. So I would just encourage you to please continue to reach out to us at the Learning Collaborative, and we can keep these discussions going there. So just to lead us through a quick closing here, Again, in case you missed it earlier on, this is how to access the atlas. The Social Norms Atlas, you can find it on the Align platform at this link, or you can just search it in your Google Social Norms Atlas, Align, and it should pop right up. Of course, we'd like to acknowledge the Social Norms Learning Collaborative, which facilitated the building of this tool. The Learning Collaborative builds knowledge and develop tools among researchers and practitioners across regions and disciplines to advance effective ethics-informed social norm theory, measurement, and practice at scale. And this tool presents work of the Learning Collaborative sector-specific working groups, co-led by Learning Collaborative members and Passages leads. I'd like to briefly thank all of our contributors here, including our sector leads and our Learning Collaborative contributors, which largely gave unpaid labor to the creation of this final product. And we really think them. It would not be possible without all of their hard work and expertise. And last but certainly not least, definitely a big thanks to all our sponsors, including USAID, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Again, please feel free to reach out to us with more questions or comments. We'd love to hear from you, and our contact information is there. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. Thank you, Jasmine. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.